distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, students and friends of the Hertie School. My name is Cornelia Woll. I'm the president of the Hertie School and professor of international political economy, and it is my great privilege and pleasure to welcome you all here today, whether online or on site in our Henrik Enderlein Forum for an evening of debating policymaking and regulation of Africa's digital transformation. In our interconnected world, the digital era is reshaping the landscape of opportunities and challenges. And Africa, with its vibrant dynamism and youthful population, stands to unlock massive benefits from this transformation. Sub-Saharan Africa has witnessed unparalleled growth in internet access, which is a testament to its rapid adoption and the population, a very digitally savvy youth, the youngest in the world. But still, the continent still has to broaden internet access. Today, only 40% of the total population on the continent use the internet frequently, so growing that number is really essential. Despite remarkable progresses, challenges remain, and these include further reducing the cost of access for lower income populations and providing digital skills to enable the continent's youth to play an even more active role in building platforms in response to local challenges and sometimes also regional, national, and global ones. The journey towards a fully integrated digital Africa will require African-led initiatives and African-led multilateral governance. Smart Africa, in collaboration with 39 member states, very impressive number, we already struggle with our 27, and various partners, is one of these examples of an African-led multilateral approach to achieve digital transformation around the continent with digital spaces that necessarily are broader than our borders. GIZ, as a partner, has been supporting Smart Africa's work towards establishing an African digital single market, which will complement the African's continental free trade area and unlock further opportunities for trade and data exchange to facilitate cross-border services and growth. African innovations such as mobile money have transformed lives and economies across the continent. These innovations have the potential to offer insights that all of us can only learn from. However, the effects of disruptive technology like AI and the impact of large-scale online social platforms are also felt on the continent. Regulations on the continent to govern these technologies are still under consideration, and we know that this is a world that moves very fast. As the African population continues to grow, the stakes of the digital transformations are high, and this calls for extensive research and collaborative efforts. In academia, it is our duty to support this process by fostering engagement and partnership with and among African counterparts to understand the continent's unique challenge today and shape digital transformation policies that are both inclusive and sustainable. It is my conviction that the future of the world will unfold in Africa, and it is very important that we stand to learn from it. By nurturing these collaborative relationships, we trust that the Hertie School, through its students and faculty, as well as our Center for Digital Governance, can contribute to a future where knowledge flows both ways, south-north and north-south, east-west as well, because of course the world is always a matter of perspective. Before we jump into the panel discussion moderated by our Master of Public Policy candidate, Leslie Mills, I want to thank Thelma Efua Quaye, who heads the Digital Infrastructure Program at Smart Africa, for coming to Berlin to join us in person. And welcome back our former Managing Director, Anna Sophie Herken, who is now on the board of GIZ, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit. A special thanks goes to Niels Meinhardt, who is in charge of the Smart Africa relationship at GIZ. GIZ, I think one says, GIZ, and worked together with Leslie in organizing this event. I really hope this discussion will deepen your interest in the amazing work that is done on policymaking and digital transformation in Africa, and that you will consider exploring these topics beyond the evening. Thank you very much, and please, the floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Warm greetings from Kigali, sunny Kigali. Uh, very honored to be with you here to speak on the topic of policy and regulation on Africa's digital transformation. As already mentioned, my name is Thelma Quaye, and I lead the digital infrastructure, digital skills, and gender empowerment matters at the Smart Africa Secretariat. Now, the topic today is an interesting one: policymaking and regulation of Africa's digital transformation. And maybe before we delve into those details, it's important to understand the landscape and the perspective, right? Whether it's happening at all. I don't know is there anyone here who has done a bit of research on the digitization of the digital transformation of Africa? Anyone? Yes? Okay. And do you think it's happening at all? Yes, I see a bit of. Okay, so we would see as the discussion goes along. One thing for sure, though, is that the digital transformation is multifaceted. It's not something that one organization can do. It's not something that one country can do. It requires multilateral collaboration. And so with that, I'd like to introduce you to Smart Africa and speak a bit about what we do and our contribution in realizing the digital transformation of Africa. So at Smart Africa, we believe that there's a new story for Africa. It's not... can you hear me when I stand here? I have to stand here? Okay. Okay, thank you. So the story of Africa is different. It's not that of hunger, war, as we always see on the news. 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in Africa, in the world are in Africa. 6 out of 10 of them. And then we have 5 countries that are top reformers when it comes to ease of doing business. Now, aside that, well, that's just statistics. But aside that, we also have a very growing and active demographic of youth. We have a lot of untapped resources. We have a springing tech entrepreneurship environment, but also the rate of adoption of technologies is very fast. And so it's important to understand these dynamics when it comes to Africa. And I'm sure you saw the first slide, which has the Smart Africa's vision of realizing a single digital market. And so my next slide talks about why we should have it. Is it necessary? Should we do it just because Europe did it? For us, we think it's necessary because the bigger demographic of Africa will not be able to be absorbed into the mainstream corporate. And if we will be successful, we need to be able to foster entrepreneurship and innovation. Now, fostering entrepreneurship and innovation also requires skill. So if I took Ghana, where I come from, the population is 30 million. If you compare a population of 30 million to a population of 1.3 billion, definitely coming together as a single digital market to harness those opportunities for our youth is the way to go. And beyond the people, also for businesses, it helps them to thrive in terms of the numbers. And so basically we think that, yes, we need to come together as a continent to be able to achieve or to be able to prosper. Now, it's easier said than done, right? This is 50 plus sovereign nations you're talking about. Cornelia mentioned how difficult it is with 27 in Europe. How are we going to be able to do this? We have over 50 countries, 50 sovereignties. We have also very limited infrastructure across countries. Well, the digital transformation is happening, but a lot of the countries is also from a national perspective. So they are looking more inward than outward. Yet we see that if we are going to transform properly and efficiently, we need to also have cross-border digital transformation. And then the issue of skills. The skill set is very, very low in Africa. And so our aim at Smart Africa is to be able to unlock Africa's potential through a single digital market. And how are we going to do it? It is through a bold and innovative multi-stakeholder approach. What does that mean? It means that we acknowledge the fact that we cannot do it alone. It has to be through partnership. It has to be through different stakeholders, each leveraging on their strength. And so that's the background of why the single digital market. Now, a bit of history of Smart Africa. In 2013, 7 heads of state met and decided that they needed to create Smart Africa to be able to accelerate the digital transformation that had already started. And out of that meeting came a 5-point manifesto to put ICT at the center of socioeconomic development, to improve access to ICT, especially broadband, to improve accountability, efficiency, and openness through ICT, to put the private sector first, and to leverage ICT to promote sustainable development. And this was also endorsed by the African Union in January 2019. You would see later in our governance the role that African Union plays. To date, we have 39 member states, and for us, Smart Africa is more demand-driven than supply. So what do I mean by that? The African Union, at the heads of state meeting, acknowledged and endorsed Smart Africa. So we could have said that we are in the 50-plus countries, but we need a coalition of the willing. And so we want countries to come on board when they are ready and they understand our vision and they are ready to play their part. And that's why, till date, we have 39 member states, all leading a flagship, one flagship or the other, and all aligning to the vision of coming together. You saw that one of our manifestos said we needed to put private sector at the center. And so we don't only work with governments, but we also work with private sector, international organizations, academia, civil society as well. And this is the host of, on the screen, is the host of private sectors that we work with at the moment. And this is also, this shows the international organizations that we work with: the African Union, European Union, NORAD, GIZ, BMZ, and the rest. We have the World Bank, ITU, and the rest. So we are truly living the message of a multi-stakeholder approach. Now, in terms of our governance structure, we have the main organ, and the highest decision-making body is our board, which is made up of the heads of states of the 39 countries. And then we have the steering committee, which is made up of the ministries of ICT of the 39 countries, and the private sector, the CEOs or the representatives of the private sector. And so our anchorage in the countries is the ministries of ICT. And then there's the secretariat where I am, and led by Mr. Lassina Koni. To support our operations, we set up the consultative organs, and we have 4 of them so far. We have the Council of ICT Ministers, and this is where matters of jurisdiction are discussed. This is where the ministers meet alone as ministers and discuss legislative instruments that they want to pass on a cross-regional approach. We also have the private sector forum, where the private sector meets and discuss actions. And then we have the Council of African Regulators. Now, the uniqueness of the Council of African Regulators is that even though we are 39 member states, it goes beyond the 39. So it goes to all the 50 plus. And we meet 4 times a year. And these are the machinery that helps us to progress on our harmonization works. And then we have the Council of African Information and Technology Agencies who help us on the on-ground implementation. So later on, I'll show you one of our projects, SATA, which is being driven by the KAITA, as we call it. Now, this flowchart is to show you how we work. Our general approach is divided into 4 main pillars. Based on priorities that we receive from countries, we develop a concept note. After the concept notes, we develop a blueprint, and usually the blueprint would be a Pan-African blueprint, giving a framework on what should be done in a particular topic. So it could be a blueprint on digital skills, on digital ID, on smart cities. It has a Pan-African perspective to show what has to be done. And then after the blueprint, we move into pilot. So we don't just want to create documents, we want to implement. And so we test some of the recommendations that comes from the pilot project within the blueprint. And then after the pilot, if the countries find it useful, which we have found that they always find it useful, we move on to scale up, which is the last part. I'm not able to. Okay. Sorry. Which is this part. The scale up is this part. And in this case, we would create a special purpose vehicle depending on whichever project it is. So each project has a unique vehicle, as a unique approach to it. Now, this is just to show the bouquet of projects that we are working on at Smart Africa. You will see that a number of them have progressed over the years to scale-up projects. We have 8 of them at the scale-up level. We have 15 at the pilot level. Pilot means we already have a concept, we've developed a Pan-African blueprint, and now we are implementing a pilot to test the recommendations within the blueprint. And this is how we have moved. If you saw this chart in 2020, a number of these projects were here. It was more heavy at the concept and blueprint, but as we move, it becomes more heavy at the implementation stage. These are some of the examples of blueprints that we have delivered. It's about 12 of them, not all of them are here, but these are just examples of blueprints, Pan-African blueprints that has been delivered. And then examples of pilot projects. So after we created the startup blueprint, we also developed a toolkit to support our countries to be able to develop their policies and their framework. That is the national policies and framework, which makes it very easy for any country to pick up and develop one instead of going through the whole process. We've also implemented an agriculture information management system in Zimbabwe after the blueprint. So this is also an example of a pilot project. And then we have the Smart E-Waste project in Rwanda, which is an outcome of the Smart Cities blueprint. And this you will find it in the markets in Rwanda. Anyone who has plans of going to Rwanda should try and visit this. It's actually there. And then we also have the scholarship fund. So what this does is to support students at the master's level who are focusing on technology or policy like yourselves, but cannot afford. And so we support them. So far, we've been able to support 82 graduates, 40% of them women. We are looking to be able to increase the participation of women for the next round of scholarship. And then we have the Block Smart Africa Fund, again for our entrepreneurship and innovation portfolio to be able to support good startups. We are looking to be able to create African unicorns. So far, we've supported 5 of them and looking to support some more. And then we have the Smart Africa Digital Academy, which was heavily supported by the German government. Currently having 14 national digital academies, and these digital academies are driven by the government. So we don't go to them to tell them that this is what you have to train. The government come to us with their priorities, and we support them to train. So far, over 7,000 beneficiaries, majority of whom are policy and decision makers like yourselves. And we are looking to see how we can also collaborate with Hetty School to be able to increase this number. We've been also able to work with 30 countries so far, and the rest is the breakdown. This is public document, so it can be shared afterwards. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier on the project called SATA, and this is a data exchange platform where it's actually the foundation of the single digital market that we talk about. We are looking to leverage on SATA to be able to unlock digital trade in Africa. We are currently working with the AFCTA to develop the digital trade protocols, and in terms of the implementation, leverage on the SATA framework. This picture was taken during the just ended Transform Africa Summit, where we had 10 ministers signing up to the SATA concept and wanting to participate. So I would pause here because I think that's a lot of information, and happy to take any questions if there are.
Thank you. I think we'll keep the questions. Maybe shall we have them? Yeah, after the conversation. That would be perfect. Thank you very much, Thelma. Yes. So we're at the point of this event where we move to the panel discussion, and Thelma, I have to invite you again on stage, unfortunately. Please join us. And also Anna Sophie Herken as well. Please join us on the stage. And hopefully we get to go into a little bit more detail with these questions. And please keep your questions. We'll come to that. I think I'm going to put myself here. Thank you. Right. Welcome to the Hetty School again. Indeed, it's my honor to be able to moderate this session with you to discuss a little bit more about digital transformation in Africa. I think we've heard a lot from Thelma on what Smart Africa is doing and so on. And we know that they really collaborate with the BMZ and GIZ. So I want to start with you, Anna. Yeah. You told me just now that you just got back from Nigeria. I know you're very, very involved in the digital department at GIZ and with digital transformation in general. So how do you see this interlinkage between these two divisions at GIZ, from an organizational perspective, in relation to this topic?
Thank you. You mean because I'm in charge both of the digital topics and
Exactly.
Africa, which
Yes.
is a great combination, by the way. I was quite happy about it. So how do I see the interlinkage? I think they're both, I always think about the organizational dimension and then about what we really do. I can't call it business for GIZ, but what we do sort of on the project side. And what I notice, and that's specific not only to GIZ, but that we see that there's so many interlinkages anyway. Within organizations, how we operate, we have finance, personnel, we have all this that used to be in silos. And you have to sort of connect it, and you can only connect it with digital systems, with IT systems, and so that's what we call digital at heart at GIZ. So the idea of how do we also operate internally in an interconnected way. And the same is true when we look at outside, what we do. You can't operate in silos anymore. So when you do something in agriculture somewhere, it has an impact on so many dimensions, on climate, on gender, but how do you sort of get the learning, and how do you need data, and you need to become smarter, and that's what you need. So you can't do this without digital innovation and system and really smart data. So this is what I'm not seeing there yet. I'm not there yet at GIZ, but sort of this is the challenge that I see.
Yeah. And, just to expand on that a little bit more, how do you, what do you see as the way to kind of future-proof this kind of public sector, because GIZ is working for the public sector, right? Future-proof its kind of work in this digital area, especially when it comes to collaborating with African partners in particular. What do you see as the needs in that?
I see a need which is not necessarily, first of all, linked to the digital part. I come to that later. So what I see is that you can't really plan ahead anymore. So you don't know the disruption cycles go so fast on the technical side, but also on what's happening. How can we predict what's going to happen in 7 years? So I think it's important to have strategies and all this, but you really have to have a clear vision of where you're going and then adapt very, regularly. So it used to be 10 years ago, you would have a strategic target picture, you would just sort of implement it. But you can't do this anymore. And this is why it's so important to really know where do you want to go, what's the target picture, what's the impact that I want to achieve. And then you have adapt all the time and be very resilient. And then on the other hand, you certainly need to you need the whole digital base, transformation and the foundation for that, because you need to be fast, you need to be efficient, and you need to be smart, which you can only be with data.
Thank you very much. And speaking of being more resilient and so on, I want to come to you, Thelma. In terms of, what Smart Africa does, what is the particular strength of Smart Africa, in particular on this, topic of dealing with, the single digital market? Of course, there are other players in the field. There's the NEPAD, for example, at the AE level. At the sub-regional level, there are offices in ECOWAS, etc. What is the strength of Smart Africa specifically, in your view?
You're right. So Smart Africa is not the only organization, but our uniqueness is that we are multi-stakeholder. So Smart Africa is the only organization that has countries, but also private sector. So I call it our constituents. We have countries, we have private sector, we have academia, we have international organizations. So it's a very unique constituent, especially because of the private sector. The other one is the trust capital that we have. So you saw our governance structure. The highest body is made up of heads of state. So when we go into a board meeting and the heads of state decide on a direction, it's quite heavy, and you find that people adhere to it. So that's also one. But another thing, the last point, Leslie, is the fact that we are very keen on implementing. So if you look at our project life cycle, we don't just stop at blueprint. We go ahead to pilot, to test. And we've seen that at the stage of piloting, even countries who were sleeping suddenly wake up. And that's what we saw with the Smart Africa Digital Academy, because it's tangible, right? The countries see it, and they are able to tell the results. So these are some of the things that, sets us apart.
Interesting. You mentioned something about, the Smart Africa Digital Academy, for example. Of course, that then brings me to this whole question of digital literacy. It's, as you know, the continent has a burgeoning youth. Lots of young people are coming out of the universities. And there's a lot of demand, I think, in my view, for a lot of tech and so on, and experts in various domains. What do you see as, in terms of, and also I want to talk specifically about women in particular, getting more women involved. So in general, around the world, we have this problem of not enough women in tech. They always talk about this, right? So how is Smart Africa dealing with this question? Digital literacy, but in particular women, getting women involved.
Right. Okay, so I'm quiet because I think that the problem is beyond just women, right? It's a certain marginalized group. And that marginalized group is a mixture of both women and men. And I want to be fair to men as well.
Yeah.
So,
of course.
First of all, the youth. So the Smart Africa Digital Academy, we have 5 slices of our target group. The policy and decision makers, which we have focused on till date, is just the top layer, which is the smallest addressable demographic. The next is the youth. Now, the youth is a huge problem for us, or a huge opportunity for us, because it has a security threat if we don't solve it. It has immigration problems if we don't solve it. And it affects not only Africa, but also our neighboring continents. So what we have done is to further slice the youth into 2, because we have 20 million youth coming out of school every year, but the job opportunities that exist is only 3 million. Mm-hmm. So what happens to the 17 million? And that's where the lens of entrepreneurship comes in. We believe that it's very, very important to foster the entrepreneurship environment in Africa. And then there's also the part of giving competency-based skilling so we can outsource the skills, just like has been done in India. I learned yesterday also about Costa Rica. So these are some of the things that the Smart Africa Digital Academy is doing to give the youth skills that are relevant so they can either use it in Africa or export it, which brings us some income, but also to support them to be entrepreneurial. Now, when it comes to women, it's transversal because most of our activities, we ensure that gender is taken care of. But that also has a risk, because then everybody would think the other person is doing something on gender and nobody gets it done. So we then curated a full portfolio on women, on gender. Even though every other project takes it, this project now becomes the monitoring tool to make sure that it's being done, but also a monitoring tool to measure the number of women coming into it. We also have a mentorship platform beyond, of course, I mentioned skills earlier. Okay. Mentorship, because it's been proven that visibility and representation matters when it comes to encouraging women to come into STEM, but also staying in it. I find that encouraging them to start is not the problem, but supporting them is a problem. And so these are some of the tools that we have put in place to be able to take them along from the classroom till the boardroom.
Thank you. Wow, thank you for that. Now, I want to come to you on this same topic, Anna Sophie. How are you thinking about it at GIZ? Smart Africa, of course, is dealing on this topic, but because Svenja Schulze, the Minister of Economic Cooperation, has really kind of pushed this idea of a feminist digital policy or something like this. But how are you implementing it? What do you see as GIZ's approach to this topic?
First, I have to say that when I now visited Lagos, but also Kigali 2 weeks ago, I was impressed how many women we actually have in the program. So I think that's more where we can learn from you, because I think your numbers are much better than what we have here. And you're correct, I think that you mean the feminist foreign policy. So
exactly.
in whatever we do, we certainly look at the gender impact, and we have dedicated projects to support women and girls, but even for the, let's say, other projects, neutral projects, we would always have a look what the implications are. And so this is something that we certainly look at, because I think when you look at digital transformation, there's huge opportunity sort of to increase education for girls and women. They're like on health sector also, but then you have the downsides if you don't do it right. I wouldn't call it the patriarchy of digital transformation, but you certainly have to have an eye on this and really see that you steer against it and that you do it right. And that's what we do.
Okay, very interesting. So let's talk maybe a little bit about this, a little still on this topic of leadership in particular when it comes to women being involved. Because you mentioned being on the boardroom, right? I find it interesting that there are a lot of ICT, a lot of the ICT ministers in Africa are actually women, yeah? And I used to work for one in Togo. Yeah, very, very interesting times. But, you know, I wonder if you can share some of your own career experience, you know, in this, getting into this field. You know, what are some of the insights you've had so far? Yeah, and now I think I want to hear also from you, Anna Sophie.
Okay. So, I did engineering in school. And why did I do engineering was simply because I was told that I was bright, right? And at that stage, there was nothing like I'm a girl, so I can't do it. I never had that thing that you are a girl, so you cannot do it. I rather had it when I got to the C-suite. That is where the challenge was. But then what helped me was, as I mentioned earlier, mentorship, but also seeing other women do it. So, for instance, in my country, I was the second woman to become the chief technical officer of a mobile network operator. But I wasn't afraid at that time because I had seen somebody do it, and she was my mentor, right? So mentorship has played a very big impact in my career, and that's why at Smart Africa, when I had the opportunity, we created the network of ICT ministers. You rightly said a lot of them are women, and so we are leveraging on that to be able to drive girl participation in ICT, and it is tiered because we also know that, a high school student would feel timid in front of an ICT minister, for instance. So we let the ICT ministers mentor, let's say, master students or mid-career women, and then the mid-career women mentor the next level. But also representation matters. So it's important that we tell our story to be able to encourage the girls. So yeah, that's my career in it. That's not all, but in a very short version of my career.
How about you? I'm a lawyer, which is a bit more balanced, I would say, gender-wise. I think for me, and also I spent some time in the international financial sector, which is very male-dominated. I think the big turning point was when I started my career more in the finance economics area. that I was a bit intimidated because there were all these men who seemed to be so much smarter. And then at one point, I really became an expert in one subject, which seemed to be very complicated. And I understood that they were all talking bullshit. And that was my big point of revelation. And I thought, if they talk bullshit, I'm fine. And I think that was my free-up moment. And then for my career, also in the financial sector, I certainly always promoted women. And I think when you come more from the leadership side, it's important that you have hard numbers, that you tell your team, if you don't come up with 50% women on all levels, you then don't get your bonus, you don't perform. And then I think once you get to a certain number, you have to change how we work, because that's like, I'm in an age where I had to adapt to this male-dominated 50 years, whatever, working style. You know, you work long and all this, and I think we have to change, and that's at least true for here, how we work, because you want everybody to feel okay in the workplace. And so I think you do a mix of number and trying to change culture, and then you make it much easier for everybody to be part of the workplace.
Thank you very much for that. Now, speaking of, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit. We talked about women, we talked about digital literacy, but I really want to touch on a topic that you raised, Thelma, about infrastructure. And this is your bread and butter, more or less. I'd like to hear from you what you think about, so how is Smart Africa thinking about, in infrastructure, especially in the sense of this issue of getting states to kind of collaborate with each other and to kind of pool resources to build projects. Very recently, I was very happy to learn that Ghana and Togo had signed a deal on roaming, for example, which then would reduce the costs of roaming, etc. There's some moves to make it easier for people to travel on the continent, etc. Right? So, what is Smart Africa doing specifically, and what is your view on infrastructure in general in Africa?
So I think is a widely known view that we lack in infrastructure, digital infrastructure specifically. And it ranges from data centers, from internet connectivity, etc. So if you take data centers, for instance, Africa owns only 1% of the whole world's data centers. That is the multi-tenant data centers. So when governments became aware of this situation, I call it a knee-jerk reaction, was you'd find that a lot of governments are creating their own data centers. In my opinion, it's not efficient to have 50+ government data centers, right? Yes, we need to grow data centers, but it's not efficient. And so we came up with an idea, and after doing a listening study, we went around most of these government data centers and realized, yes, the infrastructure is there, but most of them are less than 20% utilized. That's a waste of resource. So what we do is to help these countries. So we take, let's say, a cluster of countries. You guys need to agree on a set of principles to trust each other on cybersecurity, on data governance, on data exchange. And once you have set that framework of trust, you can share data centers. And on top of those physical infrastructure, we are putting a cloud technology on so everybody can access and use it. So that's one way of ensuring that we don't have 50+ government data centers, but then there's also trust, because the idea of having their own data centers is sovereignty and trust. So now when 4 countries or 5 countries or 6 countries are able to trust each other, then there's efficient use of resource, right? Then there's also the first mile or the middle mile and the last mile infrastructure. A lot of countries focus inward when it comes to connectivity. And there's a lot of benefit if we did a cross-border connection. Currently, I'm based in Rwanda. If I want to call my grandmother in Ghana, the call goes to Sesimbra or London or somewhere before it gets there, right? And so if we did that intra-connectivity, it would help. And that's something that we are doing with Badia, that's the Arab Development Bank. And recently also the World Bank expressed interest in it. And what we do, we are not interested in reinventing the wheel. Some private sector have already invested in this. So we leverage on that, work with them, and we fill in the missing links, right? So if MTN or Econet or whoever has put in already, which most of these operators, because they are multinational, they would have put in that infrastructure. So we leverage on that through an open fiber system. That's one. That's another one.
Danny, you want to say something?
I'm just wondering whether we want to open up for questions.
Oh yeah, we'll open for questions in a few moments. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Can I ask one thing on the data? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. You have your chance.
On the data center, was that legally a problem if you go, like, on a regional level? Is that a difficult? I mean, like, how did you address it legally? Was that very problematic?
So the issue was just for them to be able to trust each other. Okay. And the good thing is that so we are doing it in Ghana, Rwanda, and Djibouti. Burkina was part, but it couldn't start. Now, these three countries already have some sort of legislation on cybersecurity, on data governance. So what we do is to put them together, harmonize, and have them trust each other. It's currently at pilot, but I'm sure once it gets to the commercial or scale up, it will take another turn. But at least the idea is seeded, and they see that it's working, right? And it also brings a lot of efficiency, for instance.
Yeah, what I'm curious about with that issue on trust is actually, what are some of the obstacles actually, and actually preventing this trust from getting built, for example. And I wonder if GIZ is thinking about some of these things already. Maybe we can talk about it later. But yeah, I wonder what you find to be the obstacles.
It's a matter of sovereignty. Right, everybody wants to protect the piece of their cake, and now governments are also beginning to understand that there's something called a data economy, and the more data you have, the more revenue or resources you would have, and so it's a matter of protecting their cake, right? And also, sovereignty basically. But if we are able to establish that trust, then using that shared infrastructure becomes easy. And it's not only in data centers. It's the same thing also in even how do we get edge routers into the continent so that our internet experience is also much better like other continents.
Okay, and I guess to rephrase my question, how, in terms of GIZ and the way it plugs into this whole need for creating trust and digital sovereignty, etc., how are you thinking about it, and what's the offer of Europe actually, I guess maybe Germany in particular, to Africa, to Africa's digital transformation in particular? What do you see as what's the key offer?
I mean, we certainly have a lot of policy and framework ideas that we can offer, and my expert colleagues here will know much more about it. On the business side, I have to say, when I went to Kigali in Lagos now, and I looked at some exciting fintechs and insurtechs, I thought there's a lot that actually they can offer. So I think on the business side, it was more the other way around, but certainly on the policy and the framework part, this is where GIZ certainly comes in.
Very interesting. And I think that is interesting because, so when it comes to this whole issue of digital transformation and what sovereignty and so on, you strike on also another interesting chord because, these digital issues for the time being are predominantly limited to ministers of digital economy, ministers of communication, etc. but not so much on, ministers of foreign policy, for example, or foreign affairs ministers or something. I know in Europe this is becoming a big question. Estonia has its own, within its foreign ministry, has a minister of digital something, cyber diplomacy, things like this. So in terms of, what is would you call that is that a problem still, or is that something that you feel Africa is dealing with in a different way? And then, so how is Smart Africa kind of dealing with that? I know working with the heads of state, I don't believe they're very directly involved. They give the power, they say, good ministers, go do the thing, right? But is it a model that works for us, or would it be better if we went toward this direction?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Very, very good one. It's a problem. It's a problem because even in hierarchy, you'd see that some ministers of ICT are not within the country are not there yet. You typically find that it's the ministers of finance who are closer to, actually making the decisions. But we also have some countries that have seen this and acted upon it, right? So, for instance, Rwanda, ICT is central. So we deal with the minister of ICT, but she's able to also bring in the other ministers, and they tag along, right? And I think it's a model that is worth emulating in all the other countries. The other thing is also to be able to speak the language of the other ministers. If you keep on talking tech, a typical finance minister will not, you always put the money in transport or something. So if you're able to then bring out the value of tech in GDP terms, in economic terms, then you speak as them. So that's also something that we as ICT experts need to pivot to be able to speak their language. You need to speak the language of agric. You need to speak the language of health. I think COVID helped us to speak more the language of health. But then what is next? We need to be able to speak their language to be able to convince them.
Do you have any?
No, I think basically you have to have it holistically all over. And I think it's always the discussion, is it better to have one ministry, or is it better to have each bubble in different ones? And I think in the end, the most important, it has to come from the top, and there has to be agreement that this is really a holistic matter. And as you just said, it's the language. If you come with super technical language, you will lose everybody, even in the finance ministry. So I really think it's about sort of agreeing that this is holistically important.
Great. So in terms of, just because the final question before we get to the Q&A. So we're talking about speaking a certain language. This is something for the policymakers and for the policy advocates. I mean, there are a lot of policy people in this room, including my dear colleagues and students as well. So in terms of career, let's maybe have a word on career. So, what would be your so you mentioned already this need to be able to translate these, policy kind of needs in a way that makes sense for traditional policymakers, especially in the economy and policy and so on. So what kind of areas of expertise are required now for this kind of work on policy for Africa's digital transformation? And, what are the interesting opportunities for research, for, student work, etc., to, get involved in this topic? Would you like to share?
It's a huge opportunity. Currently, only 1% of Africa's GDP is dedicated to research, right? So that's a problem in itself. So that's a problem and an opportunity in itself for research. But that being said, we also have diverse needs. Agriculture, we need to develop agriculture. Agriculture is a very major GDP vertical, but then how do we leverage digital to make it more efficient so we can make some more money out of it? We have a lot of arable lands. How do we make it more efficient? These are some of the skills that so we need people who understand tech, but also understand these things, who understand agric, who understand health, who can help us digitize transport, for instance, who can help us in all these areas that Africa is. And the good thing is that Africa is now, we don't have much of a legacy technology. So it's almost, I don't like to use greenfield, but it's almost a greenfield. And so there's the opportunity to play with it and, do much more. And I encourage most of the African students here, once you are done, please come back to Africa and do your part, because we need your brain. And even those who are not Africans, you are welcome.
Absolutely, I'm sure there'll be many of them. All right, so we'd like to open the floor up to questions. I'm hoping that you have a lot of them. Danny, of course, finally. So Jimena will come to you. Yeah.
Give me a second. Sorry.
It's on?
Yes. Okay, perfect. Okay. Yeah. First of all, sorry, I apologize for interrupting. I was just so inspired by your talks. So I have many questions, but I keep it to two. My first question is about, basically about your last point, Thelma, about how in Africa the emerging digital markets are an opportunity to develop new kinds of products, services, new platforms. And so I was wondering whether you could, and I think you showed us some examples here, but I was wondering whether you could talk more about the role of sort of homegrown companies and startups as opposed to, and their relationship to the big tech companies, because what I've heard is that a lot of the big Facebook, US-based tech companies are coming in and using these deregulated markets strategically to experiment with new products that they can't test in advanced industrialized economies. And so I was wondering whether you could talk about this. To what extent is this just a rumor? Are there some examples? And then second, now that China and Chinese technology companies are also coming in, what is the space of these in the I think 38 countries that are part of the organization that are sort of more divided between sort of the US company influence, the Chinese company influence, and perhaps also more independent. So that's just my first question, but I don't want to occupy the space. So I ask my other question later. Thank you.
Okay, that's an interesting question. So for the second part, I'm not sure I have the metrics, but for sure I know that the Chinese is more into transport, more on physical infrastructure. Yeah. Now for the SME, it's for the first question, it even goes beyond just the SMEs. So even when it comes to our data policies, because we are not harmonized, the big techs of the world are able to take advantage of the lack of harmonization and fragmentation to their benefit. There's work ongoing on it, and next week Monday there's even a meeting in London on this. So there's work ongoing to address it, but to some extent, yes, you're right. Lack of regulation allows them to have a field day. And our SMEs, I think what we can do to help them is really to give them the environment to thrive. Because these Facebooks of the world, or the big techs of this world, were once SMEs, and they got support. So what we are doing, and as I mentioned earlier, is to also see how can we create such unicorns so that we can also have a seat at the table. But then it's a bit hard for us because the likes of China have 1.3 billion population under one sovereignty, right, under one jurisdiction. We have to deal with 50 plus jurisdiction, and we want to be able to use digital to break down those barriers. We cannot create one country in Africa because we are so diverse, but we can leverage on digital to be able to create a single digital market.
I'll just ask a short one, and then we won't dominate in this front row here. So I'm from GIZ, Dominic, and I have a question for you, Thelma. In a recent report from the World Bank, they were actually looking at digital transformation actually in the Latin American market, but one of the key things in their report was we need a new mindset of policymakers and regulators to help them think kind of in a new way about regulations and policies. And I'm looking now at obviously the slogan of the House here, which is understand today and shape tomorrow. So would you maybe say what Smart Africa is doing to support exactly this, understanding today and shaping tomorrow, with a focus on policymakers and regulators? You mentioned it briefly, but maybe you can say more about it. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dominic. So I worked in the private sector, in the telecom, and at that time I had such a hard time with my regulator because they regulate to regulate. They regulate to penalize you, and it's a very common thing across Africa that regulators are there to be more punitive rather than support the industry. Now, what we are doing is to try to change this mindset to be more regulation for innovation, right? And this is through the Smart Africa Digital Academy that I had mentioned earlier, where we take certain topics, it could be an emerging tech or even existing tech, but we curate courses around this and train policy and decision makers. So this could be regulators, telecom regulators, data regulators, cybersecurity regulators, ministers, their agencies, their chief directors, to train them on the benefit of regulating for innovation. And I mentioned earlier on my slide, so far we've touched over 7,000 of these, but it's not just to capacitate them and leave them. We want to get to the point where we capacitate them, but we also handhold them to draft those policies and also so institutionally support them to implement the policies. Because we have also found regulators in countries with very good regulation, but they are not able to implement. They don't have the ability, either the skill set or the institutional capacity to implement and enforce. So we've started on the capacity building, but I think that is just a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. We need to be able to, after building their capacities, hold their hands to support, draft those policies and help them to implement. So these are some of the things that we are doing, and thanks to BMZ and GIZ, we got a grant and we've been able to be very successful for the pilot. We are moving into the scale-up with World Bank from next year and hoping to do more in that area.
I have a question too.
Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Please, yes, go ahead.
I was wondering, you have so much like stage skipping, leapfrogging or digital leapfrogging. And I was wondering, you can certainly see perhaps why there are more success cases on the African continent, but I'm still trying to think, what are the success factors and how could we learn from that to be better in this too? Because when we do leapfrogging, it's usually not really like the big skips.
So I didn't mean to make it look all rosy. if I did, because we do have failures as well. But I think the success factors for us has been taking the beneficiary from the beginning, designing the project or the solution with the beneficiary. So there's ownership. Once there's ownership, they're able to run with it and it's sustainable. But if you do it a top-down approach where you go and say, look, this is what you need, then there's no ownership and it fails. So I think that is one key thing that stands out for me with our approach at Smart Africa. Then we also do not wait till all the 39 countries are aligned. If 2 countries are aligned or interested, we start with them. And once they have done it and the outcomes show, the others automatically follow. With SADA, we started with 3 countries or 5 countries, and now we have 17 countries. And that's because these 3 countries did well. They went back to the steering committee and the board meeting to report. Then other countries got interested, and it has a rolling effect. But essentially, I think the bottom-up approach, or designing with the beneficiary in mind and together with the beneficiary, has been our key success factor.
Further questions? Yes, we have 2. I see Sophie and one in the back. So let's start with Sophia.
Thank you very much for the interesting discussion and all of your interesting points and takes on the topic. You mentioned multi-stakeholder approaches, but also you need multilingual approaches on such a diverse continent. And I would be really interested in, especially when you, for example, talk about artificial intelligence, large language models, that you have a diversity of data in different languages, but also even content moderation on different platforms. How does Smart Africa actually tackle this challenge towards a digital single market with multilingualism?
So, first of all, even within the operations of Smart Africa, we have that challenge of we've been focusing more on English and French, but there's also the Portuguese-speaking Africans, the Arabic. Thankfully, most of the Arab countries also speak French, so we are able to be covered on that part. But for the Portuguese, it's still a challenge that we are trying to work on. But to your question on AI and how to leverage AI properly, I think we don't even have the data sets. You know, the data sets to train those AI, it's not available. And that's something that we need to work on. We haven't started that yet, but I know some countries like Rwanda, they have, I'm sure Norman will know more about it, but I know there's something like that on Rwanda for machine learning process for Kinyarwanda, which is the national language. But on the Smart Africa side, we haven't started yet.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we don't acknowledge it. We do acknowledge it. It's just we are taking it step by step.
Great. I think there's a question. There was a question at the back first, and then we'll come to Jayu and you. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much for the inspiring talk. My question was more around the bottom-up process that you shared. And so do you see a role of engaging with the citizens, and how do you actually do that? And the second question was, you shared about the different projects that you're working on, and it's really nice to see a lot of projects now in the scale-up stage. So what were some of the biggest enablers for a project to move from a pilot stage to a scale-up stage, and how did you align with all the stakeholders and build trust for doing that? Thank you.
Thank you. So to the first question, yes, we do engage with the citizens. So for every project that you have seen, we have a multi-stakeholder working group. We would create a working group that would be supported by a consultant. And some of them, we also do listening studies. I mentioned a listening tour that we did for the data centers. When we were also creating the Smart Cities Blueprint, we did listening study. where these consultants go on ground and do interviews, so we have their input. But beyond that, from the grassroots level, we also engage partners. So in a working group, a typical working group, you would find multiple countries represented from the Ministry of ICT. But if it's, let's say, an agriculture project, you would find representatives from the Ministry of Agric. You would find data protection authorities. You would find also the private sector. So and most of the private sector that you saw on my slide would be in one working group or the other. And academia, we also leverage on academia intelligence and what they have to share. So that's how we make it inclusive.
Other questions? I think there were 2 questions from Jayu, and then, yeah. So let's start with her. And yes, thank you.
So my question has to do more around the fact that digital public infrastructure, especially within Africa, has been that it's, I think, a very interesting case with regards to the fact that there are so many opportunities that the first question that comes is like, when it comes to financial inclusion in Africa, Africa is one leading with regards to digital payments and e-payments. So you see that there's a lot of investment, there's a lot of opportunities there, and there are more coming. So when it comes to this specific example, do you think there were factors that pushed more for financial inclusion? Because when you see the case study of Brazil and India, you see that there were factors within India and Brazil, like women, there were not enough bank accounts that were opened, women did not have financial safety, etc. There was a lot of corruption. So these factors pushed Brazil, especially India, to go towards e-payments. So with Africa, when it comes to picking up opportunities, what is the first and foremost way of picking up that? I think that would be, I hope I'm able to explain myself.
Yes. So the financial inclusion thing started with the M-Pesa story. So it stemmed from M-Pesa. And the one factor that made it successful was because it was contextual. There was a need for it, but then it was also contextual. People were already exchanging money in some sort, and then they had the phone, and then they developed it. And then it started on USSD, and now it has progressed. There's even the M-Pesa card. So it was, to some extent, also a bottom-up approach, because there was the need, and the people asked for it, and they got it.
I think we had a question from Jayu, and then we'll come to our colleague Jayu in the front, right there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation.
Anna Sophie also. She's
I'm
not
happy.
safe from questions.
I'm super interested in listening. Don't worry.
She's not safe from questions, huh? Yeah.
Okay.
I would have tons of questions myself.
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to introduce myself, and I had the privilege to did my professional year internship in Rwanda with GIZ, Digital Transformation Center with Norman here, and also we work a lot on the natural language processing. So there are several like open source community like in Africa that connect a lot of African academia and researchers all around the world, like Masakane and Lanfrica. They create a lot of work on dealing with different kinds of like African language, because there are thousands of African language, and also I think and also there are also like other like some universities also contribute a lot on it. So I think it's also the Mozilla Foundation, they also support a lot on the open source of African language data sets. And here Rwanda is the top, the number 3, the biggest language data set all around the world, which is a big proud, yeah. And so I have a question for Anna. So because I only did my internship for 10 months in Rwanda, so I didn't witness like the sustainability of the projects there, because like most of the projects only last like for 2 or 3 years, and then after that it won't receive the further funding. So I'm curious, like what's your like point of view, like how to make those projects more sustainable? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I start with a sentence that my understanding is that all we want to do is to have sustainable projects. So I don't know, Norman, can you jump in here? Because I would have told you, we always make sure that they have a sustainable impact, and that's what we certainly aim for.
You have the mic to
So I think Norman has to rescue me here. I don't know. I was asking, why couldn't you do a longer internship with us? And then I would have said, I think that was in my time when we negotiated the deal with GIZ, that we would have the practical internships for Hertie School. But on the sustainability, I'm surprised myself, because I think that's sort of what we always look at. No, you get the difficult one. I'm sorry. I would have given you the C-level speech that everything is sustainable, but I don't know.
No, I think we're happy we're having a new member of the board who's asking a lot of questions, and I think you are also giving part of the answers. I think if we talk about sustainability, we should, right from the beginning, a bit like Smart Africa, ask the question, who owns these projects? And it's never us, because if we do, then we already have a problem. The past days we talked a lot about the role of the private sector, so obviously they play a huge role in, taking over some of these projects and bringing it in. You had, I think, the opportunity to work with Mozilla, so we don't host, for example, speech data sets, but we make it available to everybody, so at least this is something that is sustained after, even if we would get out, but it is a hard one. I mean, we should be critical about our work, because there's obviously also stuff we push, and now I turn it into a question to both of you also, because I think part of it, in particular when you talk about digital governance, is, and referring what you said, how do we build strategies or policies where we even don't know where we go? And it's connected to the sustainability itself. If you would have been sitting here 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I think there would have been at least 3 or 4 questions about blockchain. And for some reason, it's really silent at the moment. Blockchain, we don't hear a lot, but we had 2 or 3 questions on AI. And I bet you if you come back in 2 years, most likely we will have another technology kind of browsing around in the room. So kind of pushing you a little bit to elaborate what you were saying on we have to build more flexible strategies or policies or governance structures. We also have to work with the old who have been used to very different ways of, thinking forward. What can we do to, build this kind of forward-looking agility, but yet have a path that guides us in a way. So this is kind of on the question you had. And Thelma, maybe this goes also to you in a sense. You have the blueprints, you have these topics, but looking backwards, maybe some of these topics are not even relevant anymore. So how do you make sure, you push this also as far as possible and maybe remove a little bit the hype and kind of look on the impact in itself. But yeah, it's somehow connected, and I would like you to answer first.
Thank you. No, I think as long as you're clear on, let's say, the vision and the objective and the target outcome, what do we want to achieve in Rwanda in a certain sector? I mean, if you just really are clear about this, I think then the whole, how you get there, the how, is disrupted all the time. It can be, as you say, you can have one hot topic and then next year it's something else. So I think you always, as long as you're very clear on the target picture, I think you have to be very flexible and adaptive on the how, and really sit down in a very honest way and see if you're still on path, if you're going off roads. And this is why it's, we have been discussing it internally also in GIZ. So do we know where we want to go? We know where we want to go, but how do we sort of make sure that we are always doing the best practice to get there? And I think this is what has changed, because 10 years ago, as you said, the how was very well defined. You would say, we want to do this, and this is exactly how we do it, like a project plan. And this doesn't work anymore, and there certainly is even faster pace changes when we look at the digital part. So it's not, I can't give you a clear answer. I think it's just, you have to be very strict on where you want to get, and then you have to be very adaptive and innovative and open-minded. And it's a culture thing also. I think you have to teach people that it's not like strategy is not a project management plan.
Right. Thank you, Norman. So I think on our side, we need to do more on the supporting our regulators and our policymakers to be more agile, to keep an open mind, and to embrace innovation. It's a lot of our, especially regulators, feel like they are at loggerheads with innovation. So if we're able to break that cycle and change that mentality, I think it will help. Now, practically on our side at Smart Africa, we go back to the countries every now and then to let us know their priorities, and based on that, we use it to shape our triennial strategy. And that's why, even though our vision is till 2030, we don't have a strategy till 2030. We only have 3-year strategy. And our strategy from 2022 to 2020, the first strategy from 2020 to 2022, if you compare it to now, we have trimmed out some projects because along the line, those projects it wasn't relevant. And I'm sure as we go 3 years down the line, some projects would also fall. And that's how what we do to refresh and make sure that the topics are still relevant.
Perhaps also because you mentioned it several times, the skills of the regulators. I think that's really the biggest challenge. And I remember when I was here at Hertie, I don't know if it still exists, we came up with something which was called TIE, Technology, Infrastructure, Energy, Governance, because we thought this is a major challenge. If you just leave the digital part to ICT people, you will never see change. And how do you train people at the interface? And that's something which I really see as a large challenge, so that you don't get this defensive, that's too technical. And this is something I think we really have to sort of make sure, if you want to proceed, the interface has to be clearer to most regulators, no matter where they sit in what kind of ministry. Does it still exist, the TIE? Oh, that was such a brilliant idea.
I don't know what became of it.
I think you have a question? Yeah.
Now that you are both here, usually like you listen both sides that they don't understand us. So I'm thinking more in the GIZ side. I am a lawyer also as well. This regulatory perspective that it's always a barrier, and it always takes time to change the regulation. But then the path of technology is going faster than regulation. So in that sense, how do you think that how you handle the expectations that you have in the countries? Then they have the different political situations that they need to pass those bills, for instance, or they need to implement those policies. And sometimes democracies are also like maybe with new governments that they don't continue the same way. So, and in that sense, how do you think, you also mentioned that sometimes Africa has better policies than Germany in terms of digitalization. So in sometimes it's like, why we always think that Germany is bringing better things to Africa. So how maybe can they bring them the best practices in order to merge? And how do you think that are like those challenges that maybe from the other side can understand you better in order to leverage and really like show results in the end?
I would say GIZ, we always bring the best policies and practices. But as I think the point that you said, it's the same here, because like you have regulators who are, as you said, I'm a lawyer too, who are lawyers. And so I think regulation is always behind, and sometimes it can be even of advantage, because you have depending on where you go, you have certain bubbles where you can be very creative because the regulator is so slow. So I don't know, you have to say for Africa, but I think that's a challenge that we all face.
Yeah, no, it's a general trend that regulation is so slow. And that's why the idea of sandboxing is great, to allow for innovation. I don't think we are where we want to be in terms of encouraging sandboxing, but the seed is planted. The idea is there. We have a few regulators that are doing that, especially in the areas of fintech. It would be nice to see it in other verticals as well. But yeah, my short answer would be the need to promote sandboxing concepts for regulation.
Thank you very much for that. I think, as a final question before we wrap up today, I wanted to, we've talked about the state, of course, the governments, the policymakers, we've talked about GIZ, but I kind of want to, talk about a civil society. I want to hear from you about civil society. We talked about regulators, how slow they are. But we've seen, for example, in Europe, with, for example, something like the Digital Services Act, civil society and academia have been very, very vocal to kind of push this through. And will, of course, participate in the implementation. How do we get something like that in Africa? Would you say we're also kind of in a good place within that sense? And what do you think is needed? What would you say is needed to get more civil society input in this process?
Okay, so we have engaged a number of civil societies we have an initiative called the Africa Data Leadership Initiative. And that's where we engage some of the civil societies. Now, my opinion is that there's no, it's not 100, most of them are not 100% autonomous, but also there's the need to, and also they may not be as matured as it is over here. You would find that some of them would come for other reasons than the topic that we are going to discuss. So it's important to, they are required, they are needed, they are very useful in the ecosystem if they are playing the role they are supposed to play. And so if we're able to institutionally capacitate them, and that has to be not from government, not from private sector, but a neutral party to capacitate them, then they'll be able to play their roles. I don't think they are harnessing the potential yet in Africa. There are, but are they doing what they are really supposed to do? Especially because the masses in Africa may not be digitally literate or digitally aware, or even aware of the impact of some of these regulations. It's very important that we support these civil societies from the right channels so they can do their work.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we've reached the end of the event. That is all the time we have today. I mean, on that note, I just want to say that, well, first of all, thank you for taking the time to come back to visit us. And Thelma, it's a pleasure. So for someone who is also from Ghana, I'm always happy when I see, fellow Ghanaians. And people who are Ghanaian would understand where this is from. Yeah, fellow Ghanaians. Yeah, and also I'd like to thank you all for really attending this event, coming here in person, joining us. Before we wrap up, please, I would ask you, could you please give a round of applause to our distinguished panelists? Thank you very much.